Thank you, Anna, for this great introduction. Also from our side, welcome to our masterclass. As Anna already mentioned, we're going to talk about private equity investments in small and mid-sized audit firms. It's a fresh research project that's funded by the FAR, so we gratefully acknowledge the FAR for all their support. And maybe good to mention that whatever views we're going to express here today are our own and not necessarily those of the FAR, right? And I said we, and Anna already introduced the team, but of course it's a joint effort with Ulrike, Tjibbe, Ziloy, and who is not here today, and myself. Now, we started thinking about this topic broadly, roughly a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, based on the observation, basically, that a lot of private equity investments going on in audit firms or accounting firms more broadly, while at the same time, if you're looking at the academic evidence, specifically then in this sector, we don't really know much about how these investments will play out. So today we're going to talk about what the research questions that we aim to investigate, what kind of data we have collected, but we're also still in the process of collecting additional data, why we found those research questions interesting, right? And if we have time, what's the plan going forward. Now, if you look at some statistics of the broader private equity market, it's quite a big market, right? It has about an 8 trillion industry, but we also see in that market that there are some pressures going on, right? So a large portion actually of this funding is actually committed but not yet investment. So these private equity firms are looking for investment opportunities, but we also observe that, for instance, exits are slowing down, which makes it a bit harder to sell the company or divest is maybe the better word, divest in the company after they have made changes to the companies. So typically we observe that the capital is typically locked up longer than it was maybe some years ago, which means that, or potentially means that these firms are also looking to divest in sectors that are maybe a bit more stable, that are maybe a bit more cash generating, and accounting or accountancy or audit could be a sector there that's of interest to them, because what's typical, at least for audit firms, you have a mandated audit often in a lot of European countries. There's even quite small companies, especially compared to the US, that have to have an audit. So there's a bit of a more stable demand than maybe in some other sectors. Clients typically stay with their service provider, their audit firm, for longer periods, so they don't rotate from one year to another. So they typically have longer engagement terms, which makes maybe the accounting industry interesting for private equity firms. At the same time, there's also, to some extent, interest from the accounting or audit firms themselves, right? Because typically, most or a lot of audit firms are structures as partnerships, where you have partners that provide equity to the firm, and when these partners retire, they have to reclaim their equity. Now, we see some pressures to that typical traditional model for several reasons. One reason is there's a lot of investments that is currently going on in terms of technology, for instance, which requires a large amount of money that needs to be invested, which may be difficult for some firms to raise under the typical partnership structure. There's also some pressures due to, because of how the age pyramid is structured, a lot of senior partners are retiring, but there are less younger people that can or are interested in becoming a partner or providing equity into this audit firm. So it's a bit an interest of both sides. Now, I have with me here a graph that we found in an information paper of Accountancy Europe that was published in 2025, that for Europe shows the number of private equity investors in accounting and audit firms. So it's not specific to audit firms alone, it's also accounting firms, where we see this kind of upward trend. 2025 is a bit special because the study was published in 2025, so this is not a complete year. So I can't tell you much whether that trend continues or not. So, but we see at least up until 2024 an increase in the number of private equity investors in Europe. And if we then have a look at where does this happen in Europe, we see broadly, I would say, three groups. We have the United Kingdom, which takes up a large portion of it. And then we have the Nordics, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and third block here is the Netherlands and Belgium. And these are actually the settings that we will use or intend to use in our research. What we're going to present today are preliminary results, particularly related to the Dutch setting. So the Belgian part is still ongoing. That's a plan for the future. Now, zooming in then, because we're in the Netherlands, on the Dutch case, we have some figures with us who actually show that also here in the Netherlands, it's actually quite large amounts of money that is being invested both in private equity, but also in other types of mergers and acquisitions, right? So it affects private equity around 1,400 auditors across more than 174 offices. So basically, what we're trying to show here is that actually there's a lot of money going on in these type of investments. And yeah, you can see this here. So this is quite similar to the graph that we showed you about Europe. Now it's specifically to the Dutch setting, where we also see this upward trend. And yeah, for instance, now more accountants work for Waterland-backed firms. So Waterland is a private equity investor than for BDO. If we go then across the border, a bit closer to my home, maybe a bit further from yours, in the Belgian setting, there's also one famous example. It's More Belgium that was acquired by a private equity investor and is really now actively involved in what is called a buy and build strategy, where they are typically acquiring other mid-size or smaller accounting firms. And they currently have more people on their payroll that KPMG that need to put a disclaimer out here. The more people relate to both audit, accounting, and consulting, right? If you look only at auditors, KPMG still has more auditors and also has still a larger turnover than More Belgium. But you see, there's, I mean, that's the main point we're trying to make here. There's a lot going on. Also across the pond in the US, where private equity is taking on 1 out of 3 US accounting firms. So basically what I try to show you here is, well, there's a lot of investments going on. You saw it based on the trends, it's quite recent. And if we then look at the academic literature on what do we know about what the consequences are of these investments. And we see also here, I think here on the I don't know whether you can read it, but regulators express concerns. So there's different viewpoints often on what will happen, but we actually, based on the academic literature, don't know all that much. And I will now give the floor to Ulrike.
Yeah, so the question we asked ourselves when we started with this project is really, how could PE investments affect accounting and audit firms? And we just don't know much about it since it's such a recent phenomenon. So what we do is, of course, look outside of our industry, right, that we investigate as accounting or audit researchers, and look more broadly at evidence about the impact of PE investments outside of our field. And by the way, this isn't a lecture, so if you have questions or concerns, please speak up. And of course, the literature outside of accounting has found many positive effects of PE, but is also very critical on the other hand. In terms of positive effects that we see, there are findings around efficiency and productivity gains, which come mainly from kind of resource allocation, de-investment of unproductive type assets. We also find in the literature that, and this is for general industrial firms, consumer-centric firms, there is a finding that PE adds value in the sense that it enhances the professionalization of the firm. So it enhances management practices by introducing stronger monitoring and by introducing things like performance-based incentives. So this is something that is a value proposition of PE. You have managers coming in that can give you feedback about how the firm is run. And that's one of the positive effects, which then drives some of the efficiency and productivity gains that we see. There's also findings around innovation and growth, that when PE invests into these industrial or consumer-centric companies, actually innovation becomes better. The quality of patents that are filed is becoming better in these firms. So there are huge benefits. Much of this comes also from the expansion of capital, the access to capital of these firms. But we also see lots of downsides that are being investigated and that are being voiced in this literature. Some of the downsides are organizational restructuring, right? If you come in, if you want efficiency and productivity gains, much of this happens through organizational restructuring. And this is something, of course, that's negative for the workforce, for employment overall. So that is something that has been criticized when it comes to PE investments. While there are often efficiency and productivity gains, some of the financial benefits actually comes from the PE players kind of forcing market effects in the sense that they enforce price increases, that they are trying to make the firm more competitive. But this is not always positive, right? Especially when it comes to consumers, more the market side of things, it can have very negative effects in that sense. And on top, and something that has been discussed also when it comes to PE investments in accounting, is that it introduces a very strong short-term orientation, because you invest as a PE player for a couple of years, typically 5, 6, maybe 7 years now, but you need to exit at some point. And there is large exit pressure because you need to show a financial return for your investors. Right? The APG was in the news recently that the active investments in the APG fund actually didn't go well. And that kind of shows that there's huge pressure for PE and for active investors to actually show a return to their investors. So it does increase this short-term orientation. And that's also a finding that the literature clearly shows. If you have PE investments, expect a short-term orientation because of the focus on the exit value. So when we look at these positive and potential downsides, this is also something we got interested in, because it's not clear, given the heavy regulation, that the short-term orientation will actually materialize, because there is lots of pressure from all sides, right? Be it regulators, be it the quality management control systems inside the firm. Maybe there are other perspectives on this as well, in terms of how the audit industry might be different. So again, this is for findings on industrial firms, findings on consumer-centric firms, and we are in a very different industry here, which likely does not actually easily translate, or these findings don't easily translate to our audit firms that we actually look at. This is a nice article, it's small, but I'll read it out. It's a nice article in the Wall Street Journal about doctors warning accountants of private equity drain on quality. You could be next. So we have seen private equity investments in healthcare. We have seen private equity investments in education, especially in the US. These are also regulated industries. So these are the closest things that have been investigated to kind of the accounting or audit setting because they're heavily regulated and oftentimes similarly regulated compared to accounting and audit firms. And what this doctor says, or professor and doctor, says you could see, he has observed private equity ownership of hospitals that resulted in decreased staffing and the hiring of people with less training and supervision. So when we translate this into the accounting setting, that kind of sounds dangerous to us, right? In the sense that, well, if we have decreased staffing, less staff, and we also hire people with less training and less knowledge, that's not a great value proposition for auditing. Then this other professor of public health says, well, these industries are similar because there is deep trust that both accountants and healthcare organizations have. And there obviously is a long-term concern for physicians that if they cede their practices to private equity, they may lose some of that trust with patients. And again, this should sound very familiar, right? Because auditing is the industry of trust. It is creating trust. So if that's already a concern in healthcare, well, we might have concerns in the audit setting as well. So PE effects might differ in regulated public interest sectors, of which auditing is one. And these settings are all characterized as credence goods, which are goods where it's very difficult to actually observe what the quality is, right? Even after we go to the doctor, we don't necessarily know whether he treated us correctly. Even after we have gotten an audit, we don't know as consumers or as the client firm what the quality of the audit was. And we also have many regulatory constraints, right? You mentioned it in your comment. Isn't this different? It's very different because of these regulatory constraints. And we also have very broad stakeholder interests, right? It's a profession for the public interest. And that makes it quite different from these industrial kind of consumer-centric firms that we've covered the research on. And prior research in healthcare and education actually shows that PE investments affect organizational priorities and decisions. So that also means that these priorities go away from creating that trust, from providing good services. There is a potential misalignment between what these PE investors want and target with the consumer and public interest. Again, this is something that is very close to auditing and the issues in auditing that we see. And the evidence also highlights risks to overall quality, but also the long-term value proposition. So from that research on healthcare and education, if we kind of take that and try and translate that to the audit setting, we have many risks, right? PE effects likely operate through these internal incentives and resource allocations in such setting. Now, when we look at how accounting firms and audit firms are even more different compared to education and healthcare sectors, is that in this particular setting, we have, of course, highly regulated industries, but on top, we also have ownership restrictions, right? So PE cannot just very obviously invest in these firms, in these audit firms, because the ownership restrictions, at least in terms of voting rights, that's ingrained in the 2006 EU directive, right? Voting rights, the majority of voting rights needs to stay with persons that have or are trained auditors, are licensed auditors. With economic ownership, that's a little different, that's more flexible, but the voting rights need to stay majority with licensed auditors. So that again doesn't make it necessarily straightforward for PE to invest in audit firms, and what we see is happening is that alternative practice structures are created More so in the US setting. In the US setting, all voting rights need to stay with licensed partners or licensed auditors. In the EU, it's a little more flexible, but you see all kinds of constructions that are happening, right? The PE investment might not be directly in the audit firm itself. There might be holding structures created around it. It might be that even the non-audit firm and audit firms are kind of split, and you just have an administrative service agreement between the non-audit service side of the firm and the audit firm. So it's all not a very straightforward kind of investment that PEs are making, but they are making it. So they are able to kind of go around these regulations, these complications in terms of the regulated industry. So when we then look at what regulators think, and that's kind of a summary of all kinds of regulatory statements from the US SEC, PCAOB, the UK FRC, Financial Reporting Council has made a statement about it, the Dutch AFM, of course, and they all see, well, the risks, but they also see the benefits of it. And I think that's an important conversation, or part of the conversation that we need to realize. Yeah, there are risks, and we've talked about these downsides. At the same time, there are many challenges that the audit firms and auditing in general also faces. And PE might address some of these challenges, especially in these smaller, mid-sized audit firms. All right, so we have a couple of emerging papers on the audit firms specifically. Most of this, or all of this, is actually US-based research. And much of this is descriptive or interview-based. So the first set of kind of and these are all working papers, so not published just yet, therefore not peer-reviewed just yet, but we wanted to introduce this as a kind of baseline to what we do. So the first descriptive or institutional analysis, there are two papers, and they describe that PE investments represents a shift away from this traditional partnership model that we typically have in audit firms. And that means that what does it mean, a shift away from a partnership model? Sounds very formal, but it essentially means that you shift away from discretion that always used to be at the partner level to this becoming a kind of one firm type mentality, right? So you kind of give up the power that individual partners have, and you shift it more upwards, and you make a joint decisions at the partner level with the feedback of PE, of course. We also know that in the US, because of these very strict ownership restrictions, most of these PE investments are done through these alternative practice structures that I've described a little bit beforehand. And again, in the US, it's even more complicated because in most states, 100% of ownership needs to be with licensed professionals. They also find that much of the private equity investments are actually driven by succession issues and partner liquidity issues. So lots of these smaller, mid-sized firms do realize we need capital for all kinds of investments, and we face succession challenges. And that seems to be one of the largest drivers for audit firms to accept these PE investments in their firm. They also interview investors, which is very interesting. Why are investors interested? And they do kind of show through interviews that they are interested in these recurring revenues, and they're interested in being able to scale up a firm and bring it to a professional organization, right? And we've talked about this before. They bring in professionalization in these audit firms. So that is what is attractive to PE investors. The second set of papers, two papers here, they look at qualitative evidence, meaning interview evidence, on more these organizational changes. And these studies suggest that firms that receive PE investments do change their governance and incentive structures quite a bit. They place greater emphasis on growth and profitability, also something that we know from the broader literature on PE. and they do emphasize more centralized coordination. So decision rights are no longer with partners alone. It is professionalized and there's centralized coordination. And this has implications for all kinds of things, including compensation and careers of people working there, professional environment, etc. Yes. This is a survey from Accounting Today, which is a trade magazine in the US, specializing in accounting and audit news. And they did a very small scale survey. They asked 54 firms that have taken PE investments and got responses from partners and owners, 30 of them, and all other employees, 21. And they just kind of asked, hey, how satisfied are you with your firm's experience partnering with your private equity investor? Well, partners are very happy, but not many other people are very happy. And that kind of suggests that this is very much changing the professional environment. The lower level employees said unsatisfied. Partners say, hey, this is actually pretty cool for us, right? And that might point to some issues, including issues for audit quality. They also asked, hey, who is helped and who is hurt? So kind of for the entire industry, what's the value proposition from PE investments? Not quite clear, right? Not everybody agrees here. This is accountants, 304 accountants were asked or responded. Most say, well, probably those who benefit are the partners of the audit firms that take on PE investment. Or it is the private equity firms investing in these accounting firms who will benefit. Makes sense, but then everybody else, including the accounting profession broadly, or small accounting firms' clients, might actually not be helped with that. That's kind of the opinion from professionals, right, working in that field. It's small scale, but I think that's kind of suggestive of what people think. In terms of what or how much independence there is retained by audit firms that accept PE investments, well, there's lots of control over things like the firm name. Makes sense, right? Because that is what you sell yourself on. You have some less complete control over your own staffing decisions. You have less control over your technology decisions. Leadership decisions you have less control over, but also things like firm strategy, M&A decisions, financial strategy decisions. And when you think about the implications of that, that's pretty huge. In the sense that if you don't have control over M&A decisions, that could do a lot to your organizational culture. At some point, you need to integrate these different parts into one firm. So if you don't have control over, and there's somebody sitting there, this PE investor, and tells you, you need to grow, you need to grow, you need to grow, you also need to be able to manage that, right? And I think these challenges in the longer term is something that we only will see in a couple of years from now. The last set of papers that I quickly want to touch upon is early empirical evidence on outcomes. So they look and collect many data. The main findings at the moment from an empirical standpoint is that PE investments are associated with an expansion in these non-audit services, right, where it's easier to invest and you kind of have a service agreement with your audit firm. We see that firms with PE backing do typically see expansion in terms of geographies, so what markets do they cover. We also see increased M&A activity, right, so again, this idea that to grow, you need to grow somehow, might not be organic, therefore M&A activity. And even though they use noisy proxies, there's actually a first paper that looks at audit quality in the first years after PE investments actually increases. This is something that we will also explore in a Dutch setting. We haven't done that yet, so that's on our mind, of course. But this is kind of, for now, a positive finding that audit quality doesn't seem to suffer and even seems to increase after PE investments. But overall, evidence remains limited and is still emerging. And in particular, there's very limited evidence on internal organizations in terms of how PE changes internal organization of the firm, partner incentives and workforce dynamics. And